Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
We have already seen how there is been a development of the various kinds of techniques through which texts are created, and when before writing had come into being, oral forms of communication of ideas and stories, oral storytelling had to depend on human memory, right. So, it did not have written formats in which could substitute for the human memory in any way. So, therefore, there were certain formulary structures of poetry which made that process of remembering things through the mind easier. And what we see, one of the characteristics of oral culture is that that the various features of oral storytelling, oral narratives, primarily were due to a certain economy that was enforced due to oral methods of composition of stories. And the reason I am using the word stories is because I do not want to use the word poetry, because poetry is the most important feature, because poetry has a certain formula to it. It has a certain scheme to it, whether in terms of rhyme or rhythm, so therefore, that itself, these are some of the rhyme and rhythm is associated with poetry, but what we need to understand is that the reason rhyme and rhythm is associated with poetry, because it is a oral, it emanated as oral form. Rhyme and rhythm is not so much associated with prose, because prose is more associated with written forms of storytelling, right. So, that is a very crucial point, that we need to understand certain things that we take for granted were not so much natural or given. These were creations due to the certain conditions in which storytelling were happening, the technologies which were available or not available. So, we have an oral form of storytelling which required the human mind to remember the progression of the story, and that was made easier through certain mnemonic features in which were conducted through things like rhyme and rhythm, and their various poetic features. There were also each poet, and when I say poet, we conjure in our mind naturally the idea of someone sitting down and writing poetry on a piece of paper, perhaps with a very, very beautiful kind of a plumed pen, and that is not actually true. I mean, the oral poetry, a troubadour or the bard would move around from place to place and tell stories, and the stories were not written down anywhere because writing hadn't developed. They would have stories which they knew, and it would actually be wrong to say that they were stories that they knew, because they would know some bare bones of the story, right, and they would make up the exact composition of the story then and there, all right, at the point of time. Suppose while telling a story, someone asks a question or someone gives a certain response, and the poet responds by telling another story, answers that question by telling another story. I had earlier referred to the story, the Panchatantra, for example. In the Panchatantra, you see there are stories within stories, and the stories sort of branch out. It's a very branch like structure of a story. which moves from one narrative to another, then returns back half the way, goes back to another narrative, and therefore, the Panchatantra is not only 5 stories, there are many stories in it. And so, in this process of storytelling, what happens with the oral poet, the bard, is that they have some bare bones of the story in mind, which then the reiteration of it, the iteration, exact iteration of that particular story is at that moment. Therefore, oral storytelling is a performative form. A performance is by very nature ephemeral. Ephemeral means it finishes off in the moment, it lives in the moment and finishes off in the moment, there is no record for it. Like if I were to, if this were a physical class and there were students sitting here and there was no camera there, then this would have been an ephemeral event. This lecture itself would have been a completely ephemeral event. It would exist in the students' minds and in my mind, whatever in recall, maybe some people would be taking notes, but the exact event cannot be reproduced. However, with the camera, this is getting recorded, but let me assure you that the camera is not recording everything. Camera is focused towards only a particular frame around me and probably the screen at some sort, sometimes when it is cutting into it, but it is not recording the little props which are lying at that corner of the room, which are outside the field of the camera, whereas anybody who is seated here would have a full view of exactly what is happening, the exact context in which this performance in the form of a lecture is actually happening, right. So, let us not mistake and say that today it is possible to actually record and performance is no longer ephemeral, because no matter where any performance is happening, someone or the other is holding out a camera and taking a video of it. Yes, the ephemeral quotient has certainly gone down. There are certain parts of the performance which is getting fixed in hard drives, in certain physical memory, but performance itself, you must understand, is an ephemeral form, and therefore oral storytelling is an ephemeral form. And therefore, to return to my point, when the poet or the bard, the oral storyteller is telling a story, the exact iteration, the exact story that is told in the moment. It is not something that the person has learnt by heart and therefore telling you, but the person actually has a notion of these are the points that I want to touch upon, and at that moment they bring up examples, they bring up ideas, and as you see on the screen, it says bring up epithets. Epithets is something that would give an example. If you want to tell give an example of, let us say, certain emotion like jealousy or anger, then you give a certain example of what anger could be, and therefore you tell a little story. Those collection of epithets is something that the poet knows. This one-to-one correspondence between a particular epithet and a particular context is possibly made in the moment. Certain poets would have certain favorite epithets. Certain poets would learn to pick and choose specific epithets in specific situations which are more appropriate, which convey the idea better, which the audience likes. And a good poet would also be somebody who would have a larger repertoire of epithets, who is not repetitive. Imagine if everybody compared the sun to a red rose or something, or a flower, or the yolk of an egg. If the poet was constantly, every time there is a reference to sun, he says like a yolk of an egg. Every time there is a reference to the sun, he says yolk of the egg. Then the audience would be tremendously bored. The audience would not like it. So, therefore, the poet has to refer to the sun in various forms, and that is the repertoire of epithets. But there is no one-to-one correspondence at various points of time. It is like an array, it is like a buffet of epithets that are there in the poet's mind, and the poet just goes, okay, I have to talk about the sun now, I have to talk about the river now, I have to talk about the snow now. So, I go and pick up whatever epithet that comes to my mind, which I can better apply, and that was what differentiated good poets from bad poets, as to what kind of epithets they use. and that is in fact true even today in the state of written poetry. Only thing is, in the written poetry, once it is written down, it gets finalized, it gets fixed. That is what a certain poet has written, that is it. It will not change, right, once it is printed and passed on, and it's sealed, right. But whereas in the case of oral poetry rendition, oral storytelling, the epithets would be something that would keep on altering or changing. All right. Now, the second point is that epithets will also have to be for various meters. So, there are various. So, if you understand metrical patterns of poetry, you realize that the way we talk has a certain rhythm to it. So, there is a tune which goes up and down, and that is what makes it pleasant to the ear, right. Now, sometimes some meters are at a fast rhythm, some meters are at a slower rhythm, some meters are at a staccato rhythm, some meters at a more sort of harmonious rhythm. Now, the epithets will also have to be matching the meter of that particular poem. That matching is something that is very, very important, right, because if there is no variation in the meter of the poem, of the storytelling, then it again is something not going to be very interesting to the audience. So, imagine if some poet tells poetry or story only in one rhythm, ta da ta da ta da ta da ta da ta da, then it's not something that is interesting at all. So, you have to vary the rhythm. You know, good songs are ones which move fast and then go slow, and then move fast and then go slow, and vary their rhythm at various points of time. So, as the rhythm that is occurring at that moment of time in the storytelling, the epithet has to match. So, all I am trying to assert is that memory is not a verbatim memory of the entire poem. A full epic could be something around many hundreds and thousands of lines long, but that is not, does not mean that in oral form the poet remembered each and everything. They remembered hell of a lot. They did remember quite a bit. They did not have any written record to fall back upon, but they did not have verbatim memory. So, every rendition would vary from the previous rendition. That is exactly what I am trying to tell you. Then let us move on. The need for repetition. The point is, because nothing was written down, the only way to ensure the continuity of a text was repetition. That if I heard something, I need to remember it, repeat it again and again in order to make sure that I do not forget about it. And this is very specific, very important to understand, because the way in which the memory in the brain actually operates, the neurons actually operate. And this is something that we are going to pick on later in the course when we try to understand the changes that are being brought about due to digital media. But for now, let us understand that every time we encounter a certain a new idea, all right, it produces certain changes in the chemical patterns of the neuron, the physical patterns which are there, physical and chemical changes that take place within the neurons within the brain, right. The neurons, they the synapses, they sort of ally with each other in very different sort of way each time, and that is how the brain actually remembers. Now, what happens is, once you have heard something and you hear it again, that synapse sort of gets solidified a little bit more, and when that synapse gets solidified a little bit more, the next time there is a revision. So, then that is why when one is learning something, when one is practicing something, those are the things that are getting formed. Now, if we are not repeating something, then if there is, for a very long period of time, if we have not heard about something, we tend to forget it, right. This is because once the synapse is not being used, it gets used for other things, all right, and that synapse is sort of lost. Okay. But when we again remember it, there is a sort of etching mark which is there on the synapse, it goes and falls back on it, right. So, this is the process through which memory operates. Human memory actually operates, is very much a physical memory as well, is something that we need to understand. So, therefore, knowledge once acquired within the oral domain had to be kept alive by constant repetition. There is also another aspect to this, because we understand without the presence of written text or written documents, with scripted documents, knowledge could pass from one generation to another only through repetition. It is only through this memory, process of memory, that texts could pass forward. So, therefore, you have in traditional societies rituals where these oral texts have a very important meaning. They have to be repeated each time, and for conventional understanding, it is given the status of something sacred, that the repetition creates some important sort of changes. It has some magical powers, which is something that we need not be concerned about right now. But what is important is that the very act of repetition of these texts keep these texts into being. But another point that we need to also know, that this act of repetition is not like a photocopy, it is not like a mechanical copy where the same impression is brought about in the next. Through generations, through each repetition, through each circulation, the text undergoes certain mutations, undergoes certain changes. There are interpolations that are brought in. We just saw in the previous point that even for the same oral storyteller, every new rendering of a story is unique. So, therefore, it is too much to expect that across generations or across geography, when a story gets repeated and recounted, it would continue to be the same. So, across space and time, stories keep changing. That is why when you look at mythologies or mythological stories or legends, you find there might be a commonality between stories in various states of India or various countries of the world, but there are certain nuances, certain changes which are there. The basic tenet might be the same, but there are certain changes to that story, because they are in the process of storytelling, they are getting adapted to certain space and certain times. So, they move through these time and spaces, and the story gets adapted. So, the repetition is never an exact, a fixed repetition, but rather it goes on in the form of an alteration, a mutation, and therefore, newer stories are formed, the narratives become newer. This is something that is very, very important to understand. Then oral forms are always, we should not forget that these are circulated within a personal interactive world. This is that when I am telling a story or I am giving a lecture with a room full of students, it is a very personal experience. I am interacting with each student physically. We are all exist in the physical space, whereas the mechanical reproduction that is taking place through, or in this particular case maybe a digital reproduction through the camera, it is very, very impersonal. It is not personal. It is impersonal. There is some hope of some interactivity which may be there across the forum, and I strongly recommend that you bring up all your doubts and ideas and disagreements through the forum, which I would be very happy to answer. However, there is no taking away from it that the physical interaction between teacher and student is absolutely absent in this digitally reproduced world, which is there in the performative world, in the oral storytelling. Okay. So, Moving on, as I said earlier, the speech is ephemeral, speech is performative, speech is ephemeral, and it is tied to the speaker. This is very, very crucial, as I said earlier, that there without the presence of the speaker, that storytelling does not come about. Someone else may be teaching this chapter, someone else may be teaching this essay, but will not be teaching this essay in the same way. As the same song could be sung by many singers, but each singer has their own voice and their own brings in their own innovations to the singing of the song, to the rendering of the song. And so, that is something undeniable. So, speech is somewhere tied directly with the presence of the speaker, all right. This is something that we need to talk about as to whether how is writing different from speech, because you understand when an author writes a book, the name of the author is there. So, therefore, the author is also tied to the scripted book, but the way the author is tied to the book, to the narrative of the book is very different to the way the speaker is tied to the speech that is given, and that is something that we will figure out in some time as we go along. We will touch upon that theme as well. Spoken words cannot be erased. Once said, it is there in your mind. They may get obliterated and nobody remembers it anymore. There might be a very faint memory in the mind of people, but they cannot be erased in the way a written word can be erased. Written word can be, the page can be torn up, or you can actually, if it is written with some other medium, you can erase it. You can also scratch it out, you can rewrite it, you can do various kinds of things, but spoken words cannot be erased. It can only be supplemented or denied. Someone says, I have been misquoted, I have been misunderstood, because the words that were said are there. They cannot be taken back. You cannot go around and say that okay, I am going to remove the post that I have put yesterday on Twitter. That is not something that is possible in the case of spoken words. They can only be supplemented. I can add a clarification, I can say something, but I cannot remove it in any sort of way. Speech is natural only to the extent, you must understand, speech is natural given that it is not using any physical tool. However, language is not natural. Language is something that is created by human beings for communication. Language, I mean, there are some basic form of signaling that various animals actually use and communicate with each other. We know that dolphins can or whales can communicate across great distance, almost through the ocean, almost 500 miles they can communicate with each other. So, we would say that even there the exact signaling is something that has developed. People, I think organisms do learn the various kinds of symbolisms or signaling processes, but human language is a far more evolved sort of phenomena, which we do not see the replication of it, see the evidence of it in the animal world. And I had told you something about the use of the mouth for consumption of food and the use of the mouth for picking up food. Human beings do not pick up food with the mouth, which is why the mouth is organized very differently, which makes complex use of language very much possible. So, language is more something that is innovative, more artificial, but speech, the process of making sound, is natural only to the extent that we do not use any external tool like a pen or a keyboard or something of that sort. All right. Now, in orality, we cannot have charts or lists. Orality could narrate, but not juxtapose. It cannot bring associations with each other. The word, and when I am speaking, this is very important. When we said that the presence of the speaker cannot be denied, it is tied to the speaker, we also mean that the way I say something, the particular tonality, particular way of speaking is something that gets tied to that the speaker, and that is not something that is possible in the written. In the written, that tonality could be lost. Orality is practiced in the presence of others, and the oral code is something that can't deal with the unfamiliar. It relegates meaning largely to the context. Usually when you speak, we have in our mind, we live in a literate universe. For us, we are interacting with the world of books as well as the world of lectures, but in a situation where there were no books or written material that was available, when writing hadn't yet emerged, the only way people could communicate was to create the context within the world of the speech. You could not cross refer with other books or other things, all right. So, that is something that writing actually develops better. It was not something that was developed in the oral form. Oral form, you could not create charts or lists, and provide a graph. There is no way to do that, all right. So, therefore, the only way that oral tellers would have to impress upon their listeners was, one of the things that they used was rhetoric. Rhetoric was less analytical. It impressed people through the use of interesting language, through the tone, tonality, and the argument. All right, so rhetoric did not bring it did not rely on analytical or factual resources. It is like getting impressed by somebody's way of speaking and not bothering whether the person is saying the truth or the falsity, all right. It's how convincing you are. It's very, very difficult to imagine that in our today's universe, because the moment somebody has spoken, there can be 10,000 fact checks that could be done, but that is not something that was accessible in an oral universe. People could not fact check. They would say, yes, he sounded convincing, and therefore I accept it, all right. So, rhetoric had various kinds of elements in it, that is invention, that is you create newer epithets, newer ideas, arrangement, how to organize those ideas, style, what kind of language you use, and delivery, how you present, what kind of tone, how well you talk, what kind of physical presence you have. And the fifth point, that is memory, is how well you remember. That is a very, very important element, but memory gets reduced in the world of writing. When we come to writing, there are the 3 R's of writing: the reading, writing, and arithmetic. Arithmetic, calculation, is something that is brought about through writing, not through the oral process, all right. Now, if we move on to what happens in written cultures. In written cultures, when the early written cultures start coming into being, you had various poets relying on phrase books to try to create an additional sort of memory, make it easier to remember the various epithets that they have to bring in to their storytelling. Now, initially it was looked upon as a kind of a negative practice, that I mean, the ideal poet would be able to remember everything. We have heard how Plato underplayed the importance of memory, or frowned at importance of I mean, he frowned upon the substitution of memory through writing, because Plato felt that memory is a very important thing. You need to constitute all the ideas within your own self, within the body, so that it is uttered in a sort of authentic way, all right. However, externalization of knowledge in the form of a written text is looked upon, is frowned down upon. it seems somewhere impersonal and therefore reduced. It is shown to be to access knowledge from an impersonal source is looked upon as something that is inferior. Therefore, the ideal poet is someone who does not refer to phrase books. It is only for beginners to use phrase books. This is what how the culture of writing actually develops at that point of time. All right, and we were going to constantly see that as writing technologies of textual communication changes, the ideas of the previous set of technologies seeps into the new and lives with the new for a long period of time, till such time the new stands on its own and in time gives way to a future technology altogether. All right. And so, that is something that we need to understand, that every time there is a change, it will bring something of the old and carry it on to something of the new. In the text, in the written text, one very important change is that the author cannot be reached. The author is, one cannot reach the author. You cannot refute, whereas in an oral disputation, when the speaker is always there, someone can ask a question, someone can dispute a point, but in the written text has a life of its own, it can travel without the author. So, when someone is reading it and a question arises or a dispute arises, there is no way that the author can be reached to answer those questions. So, and very importantly, imagine a situation where there is a debate happening and there are two speakers who are speaking and they say opposite points and there is a disputation and there is a finally you come to a certain conclusion, there is a resolution. Then that resolution is what everybody really takes home, that you take both the points together. However, in a written text, if there is a dispute, then after the dispute you do not have that the original text has been removed, it has been erased, it is still there, right. So, it continues to say something. It is not necessary that some reader, all readers will read both the text A and text B together. So, the disputation and the proposition need not be looked at together. So, even after, so therefore, even after refutation, the proposition has a life of its own, right. So, this is the reason why there is a tradition, there would have been a tradition why books would be burnt. The book says it is, I mean there is no way to undo the book. So, therefore, the book is burnt, all right. And the opposite is also true. What happens is that people get a sense that if a book says something, it must be true, you know, if a book says something, it must be true, right, because it is linked to this idea. People are still not able to understand how can a book speak, because what you get used to is a person speaking from their own knowledge and experience. Knowledge is something that is supposed to be internalized. A book of knowledge is not something that could be fathomed, because the book is not a living, walking, talking, living being. It is only living beings who have experience and knowledge. The book itself does not have any experience. Book is an externalized storage of experience, but the book itself is not experience. So, therefore, you are, the book is, though it contains knowledge, it does not actually contain the knowledge through the process of going through an experience and reaching that conclusion, all right. Right. So, there is a confusion here, that you know books can stand on their own, all right, because people think that if the book can say something that is something true, if the book can say something that is true, that has knowledge, then maybe the book has some magical quality. So, therefore, there is this doubt, existential doubt as to what a book really is. All right. Then we move on to the idea that written words can actually be erased, and this is tied to the previous point that books are burnt, written words can be removed, is something that you need to understand. This is before the coming of print, by the way. Print is more difficult to erase, but written words can be erased. Even when certain ideas can be etched onto stones, stones can be they would actually chip off an entire piece in case someone had to rewrite it and inscribe it or change the stone altogether. So, written word can be erased, whereas spoken words cannot be erased. But at the same point of time, till such time that the text is erased, there is no way that the disputation of that text is complete. The disputation of text produces another text, and you have to look at both the texts together. So, I hope you are understanding this complication, that the coming of the text, coming of writing at the same point of time makes erasure possible, as well as makes the presence more secure. Till such time that a certain text, written word is erased, it stays as it is. There is no way. So, even before the coming of print, a certain manuscript could be a certain text could have many manuscripts, could have several, and not in the number of, not in hundreds, but certainly in scores or dozens, they could be there. So, if you get rid of one text, one manuscript does not mean that the other manuscripts are also gone, or you can dispute one manuscript, but still the other manuscripts are being read without without the presence of the refutation. And what you need to understand is, sometimes these manuscripts are not great in number. The manuscripts would be, when they are created, they would be very rare, and they would be kept only with certain people, primarily ecclesiastical authorities within churches, with priests, with certain maybe royal families, right. So, and there would be great geographical distances between each manuscript. People would have to travel great distances to be able to read those manuscripts or access those manuscripts, or they would not have access to the manuscript. Not everybody could read or write. Most of these manuscripts would have been written in classical languages, and not everybody had literacy. Literacy is something that was rare, right. We are talking about a largely non-literate world. So, you cannot imagine a situation where the presence of both the proposed text and the refuted text are known to everybody. The presence of them are known to everyone who is accessing that particular text. All right. This is a very small literate world that we are talking about. All right. So, that is another point. The oral universe would have a larger presence, larger reach. The written universe would have reduced that reach, but that is a different point that we are going to look at in some time. Now, we understand, we talked about how speech is natural and therefore, writing is artificial, but when we say artificial, we do not say it in a negative sense, but a positive sense, that the use of technology can actually enrich human life and spirit. It enables realization of fuller and interior human potentials. Why? Because now it is possible to actually have access. With writing, it becomes possible to actually have access to experiences of people across time and space. A particular individual, a particular scholar in an oral universe would be able to gain knowledge only from people whom he or she has met. But with the coming of writing, knowledge can be acquired not only from great distances, just the manuscript comes in, then you learn about somebody else's ideas and somebody else's experience. Not only that, you also learn of the experience of generations of people before you. All right. Now, you would say that even in oral poetry, texts traveled from generation to generation. They did, yes, they did. But the plethora, the amount of texts that are available to a certain scholar or a listener was very extremely restricted, because now manuscripts have a certain mobility. One, they can travel across geography. Two, when oral texts travel from one generation to another, they do so when oral texts travel from one generation to another, they do so through mutation, whereas in a written text that mutation is minimized. When a manuscript is there, it is almost it is slower in change. Till that manuscript is written down, the text remains the same. Yes, it is possible that someone else copies that, and that copy has some interpolations into it, but the process is much slower than that of oral rendering. All right, you understand that? In the oral rendering, every rendering is unique, whereas in the written, in the chirographic world, every rewriting is unique. Every time someone refers to that text and speaks or reads it, it remains the same. All right, this is something that we need to keep in mind. So, the changes in the text, the possibility of change in the text has been arrested, has been reduced, not as much that it would be arrested in print, but in writing, which is still a manual form of reproduction. It is arrested, it is slowed down. So, 2 points: across time and across space, more texts become available to the scholars, and intellectual capacity of the human species becomes enhanced to a great extent. Now, and because of the various characteristics of text that I said, the text actually externalizes human experience and keeps it outside that of the human body. This brings about that contradiction that I talked about, brings about an association between writing and power. Till now, rhetoric was powerful, but now writing is linked with power. That the text itself can have a certain experience, the text contains a certain knowledge. So, text is often regarded as some kind of secret or magic power. All right. So, there would be people who would, and some of you may be aware of it. I mean, you write a mantra or some sacred word on a piece of paper, wrap it around and wear it as an amulet on your body to have that magic power or chant. You also have when you go to some of the Tibetan monasteries, you have these jap jantras where you twist it around and it has a certain inscriptions on it, and you twist it around and it has that magic power. So, text gets associated in the early chirographic world with some kind of secret or magic power, and this emanates primarily from the idea that that what is supposed to, here is a stone that talks, or a piece of papyrus that talks, or a parchment that talks. Can non-humans speak, inanimate objects have any speech? But here you are, the book speaks. So, the book has magic. All right. So, that is the association which is there. But there were other associations also. The societies where there are limited literacies, and all early chirographic societies had limited literacies. Only the most learned people, primarily the priests, would have literacy. They are the ones who would have literacy. It would not also always, in fact, the royal families, the rulers would also probably sometimes be illiterate, would be non-literate, so to say, because one of the ways in which knowledge is controlled, and knowledge is linked to power. The more you know, the more you can question. So, therefore, the capacity to know has to be reduced, and the only way to reduce the capacity to know is by reducing the capacity to read, and therefore reduce literacy. So, not everybody was allowed to learn reading or writing. All right. So, this is somewhere I want to bring in the idea that is this something that this restriction of knowledge is something that is coming about only in the chirographic world, only after writing comes into being? No, certainly not. Even in the oral universe, you had a situation where not everybody was allowed into every space where oral rendering is happening, right. So, for example, certain rituals should be conducted in sacred spaces, and this certain people of certain castes or certain ethnicities would not be allowed into those sacred spaces. The sacred spaces would become would get lose their purity if they would if there was anybody from another caste or another ethnicity who enters it, and that there would be certain purification rituals which would be which would be conducted in order to return the sacredness. So, there were these practices through which certainly there would also be punishments to the people who would intrude upon that sacred space. So, the space for oral or various kinds of oral rendition would have been extremely restricted. All right. Even today, you would know that when there are various rituals within the family, there are certain rituals which are only for women, and that's sort of an oral domain where men are not allowed into that space. So, there is a certain kind of restriction that oral rendering, oral universe can also bring about, and that is primarily through restricting access to that space. Now, this kind of restriction of access has been historically there, because knowledge is associated with power. All right. The more you know, the more you can question, and the more you can therefore challenge authority. So, and I would argue through this course that each new form of technology would have newer forms of making this restriction possible. It also is that with each new form of technology, issues get democratized even more, right. So, very importantly, that there is this tussle between a democratizing trend, progressive trend within communication technologies versus the need of the powerful to restrict the flow of knowledge. So, just to give you an idea, copyright is another very important mechanism through which knowledge is restricted, because print can lead to the proliferation of knowledge. Copyright becomes one mechanism through which you ensure that cheap access to knowledge becomes more difficult, right. Most of the times we are paying more for the copyright than we are paying for the actual printing or the physical book that is there. Access is also restricted. This particular set of lectures is much more accessible, because for many users they can access the lectures purely by generating a login. There is a limitation that you cannot probably access it without a login, but there is no pay associated with it, right, unless you want to take the exam. As far as I understand, that is the current mechanism through which these courses are running, but still, so this is a far more democratic, more progressive form of educational platform. However, there are many other courses, online courses, which require you to pay a certain amount of money, and moment you have to pay a certain amount of money, it restricts the access to a certain set of people who have the capability of paying that. The fees that you have to pay for educational institutions restricts the access to that institution. So, knowledge in various ways gets restricted across time, and in the early chilographic world, the limitations on literacy was one way in which knowledge was possible. But you must understand the other point is also true, whereas in an oral universe there was no way that someone from the restricted sections, whether it be caste or ethnicity, could actually enter a space where knowledge was being distributed. All right. We know the story of Eklavya. Eklavya overheard, Eklavya from a distance learned what Drona was teaching the Pandavas and the Kauravas, but he had to pay with his thumb, because he was not someone who had access to that space, but he did so surreptitiously, right, and he had to pay for it. And he had, so if he was not there in that space, he could not have gained that knowledge. He got access to that space, he gained that knowledge, but had to pay for it. He was punished. But with the literate universe, it is possible that somebody gets literacy and gets hold of a copy of the book and reads it. So, literacy is really the access. If the person gets caught either reading or writing, or gets caught with possession of that book, will be punished tremendously. But if you read the stories of the very early 19th century women learners in India, like Rashchandari Devi, if you read her autobiography Amar Jibon, My Life, there she says how she stole time from housework to read and write. She would she would sit in the kitchen and with a piece of charcoal try to learn the alphabet. And the moment there were footsteps, sounds of a footfall, she would quickly sweep, keep the charcoal and all the writing implements away, because she didn't want to be seen reading or writing. Otherwise, life would have become very difficult for her, because she would have been admonished. She would have there will be tremendous restrictions placed on her, but her determination in order to read or write, and this is something that women were not allowed to read and write, right? Because reading and writing is associated with access to knowledge, because then you can read books and gain knowledge. You cannot any longer be restricted by physical restrictions of space, right? So, these societies with limited literacies regarded writing as dangerous, because writing would mean the possibility of knowledge passing on, getting into the wrong hands, all right. And illiterate people who are non-literate, they would look upon the text at the same time as having magical properties. They would also rub the books on their foreheads, or lay obeisance to books, or pray on books, all right. And writing is a form where you must understand that writing required, it is not just going to a shop and buying a pen and writing. You know, in the early days of writing, one had to actually create the implements through which writing had to happen. You can't go to a shop and buy a book, buy an exercise copy and a pencil or a pen and start writing. You had to create your own pen. You have to go and get that piece of feather, cut it exactly, have that sharp implement, know exactly how you have to prepare the ink, and you have to constantly use it. And when you are writing with a feather quill, you have to constantly make sure that the sharpness of the quill is maintained. It is very much like a pencil. You have to constantly maintain that. So, only a few people could write, and so you had a situation where sometimes the oral poets who were good at creating texts, you know, putting together poetry, were not very good at writing. They could, because it was a certain craft and they did not have the knowledge of the craft. So, you have a case where Ved Vyas would require the help of Ganesha to write the Mahabharata, really. So, because he could not write, he was probably not literate enough. So, he could create, but Ganesha would write for him. Ganesha was the scribe, all right. So, that is something that you need to remember. So, as writing developed, when writing happens, we lose the tone, the intonation to the in the form of writing, the rhymes, the way, mannerisms through which I am saying the word, these were not there. But it was with time that you included the exclamation mark or the question mark in order to bring in a little bit of the tone through punctuation. When actors have to look at plays, they have to figure out exactly how a certain sentence or a certain line has to be uttered, because the text itself, the text of the play does not give them the tone has to be created. And very importantly is that writing, another characteristic of writing is that writing has to be done solitarily, it has to be done alone. Mostly you find most people find it very difficult to write in a group of people, whereas speech is something that is created in the presence of others. It is very difficult to speak without a room full of people. I am trying to do something that is most teachers are not used to, which is to speak to an inanimate camera right now, imagining that there are students on the other side of the camera, but to have a classroom of people, classroom full of students would make communication a lot more easier, because that is what we are habituated to, all right. But writing in a room full of people with everybody speaking is a far more difficult exercise. Even in an examination hall, silence is maintained. You are required to write on your own, right, and this is something that is very difficult for poor families. This is also a question of access, right. So, these are some of the characteristics of early chirographic resources. Just to finish off a few things about the early period, I mean, very interesting that there were times when writing comes about. This is very interesting to note that when someone puts a document together, how do you authenticate that document? Because in previous before writing, there would be messengers would travel from one place to another and utter the message of the speaker, or the speaker himself or herself would be there. But when kings would or rulers would send certain documents in a written format, they required some kind of a physical assurance of authority along with it. So, there would either be a knife or a sword or even a seal or a stamp. This is very interesting. That as long as things were written by hand, you needed a physical, immutable form to authenticate that piece of writing. But imagine a situation when today's day and age, when you type something out, you print it out, when a typed piece is there, it is authenticated not through a seal, not through no sword or something of that sort. I just wish to remind you of the story in Ramayana, for example, where Hanuman takes Ram's message to Sita. But how does Sita know that it is Ram who has sent the message? Through the ring, right. So, the physical object actually authenticates the message. Either you know who the messenger is, but in this particular case Sita had no way to know who Hanuman is. So, therefore, Hanuman is sort of kind of the written document, if he is in a position similar to that of the written document. If the Sita knew the messenger, that would be authenticated, right, but in this particular case Sita did not know the messenger. So, it was authenticated through the ring. But when a typed piece is there, it is printed, it does not carry the manual form of writing, it is authenticated through the signature. The signature is looked upon that kind of presence of the author, all right. So, there is something that is important for us to know that various kinds of the processes of writing were not always the same as in earlier days and age. Now, you understand that clock time or calendar time is something that is very recent. I mean, till about the 13th or 14th century, you did not have clock time, you did not have clear sense of date, year exactly, right. So, you had to refer to epochal periods. So, early charters did not have a clear sense of when they were written, time would not have been written there, all right. And you find that very early forms of writing would emulate the oral pattern, all right. So, when let us say the Iliad or Odyssey and other forms of poetry are created, they still follow the oral poetic process. It is only later on that forms which are associated more with the written form, the almanac, or in the case of the print, the novel comes into being. But even in the novel, in the early novels, the writers will use terms like, dear reader, today I will tell you about this story. So it is a more conversational tone, it is like someone sitting down and telling a story. So that oral remnant, that vestige of the oral form continues into the written form, into the printed form. It is only much later, by about the 19th century, that the dear reader is dropped. So once again referring to you that there are certain features of older technologies which continue into the practice in newer technologies, where the technology itself may actually demand a different practice, all right. It is only when the technology comes into being on its own that that vestige is dropped and this new practice comes into being, all right. So this even in early writing, you had when manuscripts are there, they are used to speak aloud. People look at it as a kind of tool to memory and then speak it aloud. It's almost like a teleprompter. It's used like a teleprompter. It's very important that you must understand that there are certain vestiges which are there from the oral world into the written world. This the entire process of auditing, of defense. So when you take an interview, what you are doing is it's not the written exam. The written exam is followed by an interview. When that happens, you are falling back into the practices of oral knowledge, that is checking out whether you really have the knowledge, whether knowledge is with you, whether you can only express yourself in writing or also in the speaking of it. That is what the oral defense or the viva really, the viva is a vestige of oral forms of disputations, where scholars would sit across and dispute in the presence of others, all right. So the interview or the viva is a remnant of the oral practices. Then those of you who know a little bit of accounting would know that there is a process called audit. Audit is where there is a written document which notes down the accounts, but that is audited means it is verified, all right. Now this is again a vestige, because audit is oral, is because before the coming of writing you did not have process of presenting written accounts. It would be accounts would be, you come back, you go to the shop, you buy whatever you will and say, I spent this much on oil, this much on vegetables and this and that, this is the record. So that is how financial accounts was done by oral means, and that term has stuck. So you realize that there are many things in our practices which are vestiges of previous practices of oral world. I will leave you with one last point about manuscripts. Now the early manuscripts were not easy to read, because vowels, at least in the Roman universe, and in fact in various other languages. The development of vowels is something that occurs much later. All right. So, the only way in which one could read a manuscript in the very early periods of writing would be by reading aloud. You could not, it was very difficult to read if, something without the vowels in place. So, it is not that in the moment writing comes into being, people stop remembering texts, stop memorizing texts, or stop speaking from memory. Writing only becomes an aid to memory. It still remains in the memory. The writing is there as a reference, and point number 1. Point number 2, the written manuscript could only be read aloud, could come alive only in its reading and not in its silent reading was much later development. All right. So, I will stop there for this essay, and we will take on with in the next lecture we will look at another essay by Ong, where he discusses the issues of writing a whole lot more. Thank you.